I locked the door, tried to secure it with a latch, but they broke everything. They even broke the door and grabbed me. I tried to reason with them, but they didn't listen to a single word. What they did to me. I can't even imagine that my husband was there, but because his hands and feet didn't work, he could only watch helplessly. He couldn't do anything, just stared at what was happening. And my son, he was sleeping in another room, completely unaware of what was happening. After they did what they wanted and left, I cried all night. Tears in my eyes, pain in my heart, and a small flicker of hope barely holding on. Morning came and my son woke up. He asked, "Mama, what happened?" Suddenly, there was a knock at the door again. I realized they had come back. When I opened the door, this time the landlord was alone. He threatened me, "I'll come back this evening. Be ready." I said nothing. I silently sent him out and closed the door. As he left, he kept warning me, but I prepared myself. I had already thought everything through, made a plan to escape, but we were caught again. Life continued like this. These people kept making our lives unbearable, but this story doesn't begin here. It all started 2 years ago when we first arrived in this village. My name is not important. What matters is the life I lived. And the life that was taken away from me. I am the wife of a man who looked after vast lands. When to sow the seeds, when to release the water, and when to harvest the crops. All of it was in his hands. The land stretched far and wide. As far as the eye could see, there were fields, soil, and silence. All under the control of a single man. My husband left before daylight and returned only after the sun had fallen. His clothes were covered in dust. His hands carried exhaustion. But his face showed calm satisfaction. We were not rich, but our days were orderly. Everything had its place, and for us, that was enough. We lived in a small house. Simple, quiet. A house where, as soon as the door opened, a tiny figure would run forward straight into his father's arms. Our son was very young then. Few words, but a complete smile. My husband took pride in his work. He used to say, "These lands breathe only when the right hands care for them." Perhaps that was why the owner of the land trusted him. That owner whose name everyone knew, and whose silence alone was treated like an order. To my husband, he was just an employer. To me, he was a shadow under which we lived our lives. I often thought if these days continued like this, perhaps we would never need anything more. But life never stays the same. One evening, my husband returned home with an unsteady walk. He said nothing, and I did not ask much. That night, he stayed awake for a long time. And I understood then something was beginning to change. From that day on, our lives slowly started moving toward a turn from which there would be no return. The land did not belong only to the soil. It belonged to power. Everyone knew it, even if no one ever said it out loud. The man who owned the land did not need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to make people lower their eyes. He controlled more than fields and crops. He controlled decisions, futures. In silence. My husband understood the land better than anyone else, but the land was never truly his. He worked it, protected it, and gave it life, yet one word from the owner could take everything away. The owner visited the fields whenever he wished. When he arrived, people straightened their backs, movements became careful, and conversations stopped mid-sentence. No one questioned him, no one argued. Because questioning power always came with a price. At first, that power stayed distant from us. It hovered above our lives like cloud, visible, heavy, but not yet storming. The owner used to speak kindly to my husband. He praised his work, called him reliable, even necessary. Those words gave us a sense of safety. A false sense of safety. As I would later learn, I used to watch from a distance as my husband stood before him. Respectful, quiet, steady. I told myself, as long as my husband works honestly, nothing can go wrong. But power does not respect honesty. It only respects obedience. And slowly, almost without warning, that invisible cloud began to move closer to our home. The owner's visits became more frequent, his questions more personal. His eyes lingered longer than before. Something in the air had changed, and I could feel it even before I fully understood it. That was when I realized our lives were no longer just our own. They were standing right in the path of someone who had never been told no. My husband was not a man of many words. He believed that work spoke louder than promises. Every morning he walked through the fields as if they were part of him. He touched the soil, checked the leaves, listened to the wind move through the crops. To him, the land was not just land. It was a responsibility. He knew which section needed water first, which soil was losing strength, and which plants would survive another harsh season. People came to him for guidance, not because he held authority, but because he carried experience. The owner relied on him more than anyone else. Without my husband, the system that kept those lands alive would slow down. Yet despite its importance, my husband remained humble. He never demanded more, never asked for recognition. At home, he was gentle, patient with our child, careful with me. In the evenings, he would sit quietly, washing the dust from his hands, telling our son simple stories about seeds, rain, and time. Those moments felt permanent, stable, unbreakable. But strength has limits, and my husband had been carrying too much weight for too long. I began to notice small changes, a slight tremble in his hand, longer pauses in his steps. When I asked, he smiled and said he was just tired. I wanted to believe him. One afternoon, he didn't return at his usual time. When he finally came home, his face was pale, his body heavy. That was the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of the owner, not fear of losing work, fear of losing control over his own body. And in that moment, I understood that the land he had cared for so faithfully was no longer the only thing demanding his strength. Something else had begun to take it. Our home was modest, built more out of necessity than comfort. The walls were thin, the floor uneven, but it was ours. Inside that space, we lived carefully. Not because we had to, but because we were content. I measured our days by simple routines. Meals prepared on time, clothes washed and folded, a child put to sleep with stories whispered softly. My husband never brought worries home with him. Whatever burden he carried in the fields, he left it outside our door. At night, when the world grew quiet, we talked about small things. Nothing grand, nothing ambitious. He would say, "If things stay like this, that's enough." I agreed. We did not dream of leaving. We did not dream of more land or more money. Our dream was stability. Our son was the center of it all. Every small achievement, a new word, a longer step, a louder laugh, felt like a victory. Sometimes I watched my husband as he slept, his body exhausted, his breathing uneven. I worried, but I never let that worry show. I believed hard work protected us, that loyalty created safety, that staying quiet kept life peaceful. I did not yet understand that silence can also make you invisible, and invisible people are the easiest to push aside. Those quiet dreams we held, simple, careful, contained, were already standing on fragile ground. We just did not know it yet. It started like any other day. Nothing warned me. Nothing prepared me. My husband left home earlier than usual, moving slowly as if the ground itself resisted his steps. I noticed it, but I said nothing. By midday, a strange silence filled the house, the kind of silence that presses against your chest without explaining why. When he returned, his clothes were still dusty, but his face looked unfamiliar, tired in a way I had never seen before. He sat down without speaking. His hands rested in his lap, still, unnaturally still. I asked him if he was feeling unwell. He tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him. That moment, that single, helpless moment, split our life in two. He laughed softly, as if to dismiss it, but his eyes searched for something steady to hold on to. I helped him lie down. He said it would pass, that he only needed rest. But rest did not fix it. By nightfall, his movements were slower, his words heavier. Our child watched quietly, confused by a father who no longer lifted him into the air. Fear settled into the room. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. That night, as I lay beside my husband, listening to his uneven breathing, I understood something I had never allowed myself to consider before. Our life depended on his strength, and that strength was beginning to fail. From that day on, nothing truly returned the way it had been. The days that followed were heavy and silent. What began as weakness in his limbs grew steadily, almost imperceptibly at first, but relentless. My husband, once so strong, now struggled with the simplest of tasks. Rising from a chair, holding a cup, walking across the room, all became difficult. Each movement a small battle. I watched him with a growing ache in my chest. Every tremor in his hands felt like a crack in the foundation of our lives. The land he loved, the work he took pride in, all of it began to slip from his grasp, not because he had failed, but because his body had betrayed him. I tried to stay calm, to be the support he could rely on, but the reality was impossible to ignore. The days became a blur of care, feeding him, helping him walk, smoothing the lines of frustration and fear that crossed his face. The illness was cruel, taking more than strength. It took his independence, his dignity, and slowly it began to stretch its shadow over our home. I felt helpless. The small safety and happiness we had built started to crumble like sand slipping through fingers. And as the days passed, I realized that the worst part was not the illness itself. It was the uncertainty. What would happen to us when he could no longer defend our lives, our home, our little family? The shadow of the owner, once distant, now seemed closer than ever. I could sense it, an invisible weight pressing on us, waiting. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one we had not asked for, and one that would change everything. At first, the landowner had seemed distant but predictable. His visits were formal, his words measured, and there had been a quiet respect between him and my husband. But now, everything shifted. It started with small comments, casual in appearance, but heavy with implication. A raised eyebrow, a sharp tone, a glance that lingered too long. He began to question things he had never questioned before. Why hasn't this section been watered properly? Why is the harvest not as strong as last season? Questions meant to unsettle. Even though my husband had done everything exactly as instructed, the weight of authority that once felt distant was now pressing down on us. The owner's patience had worn thin, and his expectations had grown impossible to meet. I noticed subtle shifts in his behavior. He no longer greeted us politely, no longer acknowledged the work done with a word of praise. Instead, he inspected, demanded, and judged. The air in our home began to carry tension, and I could feel the anxiety creeping into our son's laughter, making it smaller, quieter. Cautious, I tried to speak gently to my husband, to offer comfort, but he would shake his head and force a smile. There is nothing to worry about, he'd say, even as his body betrayed him. Trembling under the pressure, the person who had once been a shadow in the background was now becoming a force we could no longer ignore. Power, I realized, does not fade with familiarity. It grows sharper, and in its shadow, even honesty and hard work can feel fragile. By the end of that week, I knew our world had begun to tilt. We were no longer merely workers on his land. We had become players in a game controlled entirely by him, and the rules were changing with each passing day. The first clear sign of real danger came quietly, almost like a whisper that no one wanted to hear. One afternoon, the landowner summoned my husband to the main house. I stayed behind, waiting, anxious, but trying to pretend I wasn't. Hours passed. When he returned, his face was pale, his eyes heavy with something I didn't yet understand. Then came the words that shattered the fragile safety we had built. "We must leave. You can't stay here anymore." At first, I couldn't believe it. I stared at him, searching his face for any sign that this was temporary, a joke, or a mistake. But the weight in his eyes told me everything. Our home, our little sanctuary gone. The land we had worked on, the house we had lived in, all at the mercy of someone else's whims. I begged him to speak to the owner, to ask for mercy, for just a little more time. But my husband's illness had already taken too much. He had no strength left to argue, no voice to fight back. So it fell to me. I tried to reason with the owner myself. I spoke with trembling words, explaining our situation, our child, our loyalty. I asked for days, even weeks, just enough time to adjust, but he refused, coldly, without hesitation. It was then that I realized we were entirely powerless. The land, the house, our lives all depended on the mercy of someone who had none, and that was the moment when fear truly entered our home. Not the fear of work or hardship, but the fear of being stripped of everything we had ever known, without warning, without reason. From that day forward, I understood that survival would not come from obedience alone. It would require cunning, patience, and courage I didn't yet know I possessed. After the crushing blow of being told we had to leave, I felt a storm rising inside me, equal parts fear and determination. Our home, our land, our little world, it was being stripped away. And I knew we couldn't just stand by and accept it. I approached my husband that evening, his body slumped into a chair, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to hide it. I took a deep breath and asked quietly, "Could you speak to him again? Maybe if you explain, he might understand." He shook his head weakly. "I've already tried," he whispered. "Even if I could move, it wouldn't matter. His mind is made up." But I couldn't accept that. I couldn't just let our family be thrown into the street. So the next morning I gathered courage I didn't know I had, and I went to him myself. I spoke carefully, every word measured. "Please, sir, we've been loyal. We've cared for your lands as if they were our own. Give us just a little time to make arrangements. My husband is ill and our child. He cannot face this change alone." I looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of softness, but there was none. His expression was cold, sharp, and unyielding. "You have no right to ask," he said simply. "There is no time, no excuse. Leave immediately." My heart sank. The little hope I had clung to was crushed. I felt the weight of helplessness settle on my shoulders. We had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. And the system that had always protected him now offered no shield for us. I returned home, defeated, but not broken. I held my son close, whispered to him that everything would be all right, even as tears burned my eyes. That night, as I lay beside my husband, I realized the depth of our vulnerability. The illness had taken his strength, and the owner's cruelty had begun to take ours. But somewhere deep inside me, a small spark was lit. If words could not help us, then we would have to find another way. Survival, I understood, would demand more than obedience. It would demand courage, planning, and patience beyond anything I'd ever known. The next days were the hardest we had ever faced. It wasn't just the command to leave that weighed on us anymore. It was the way life itself began to tighten around us, slowly suffocating our freedom and dignity. The landowner's demands grew sharper, colder, more invasive. He questioned every action, every decision, as if our very existence was under trial. We tried to follow his instructions perfectly, but it was never enough. He inspected our work with a critical eye, found faults where none existed, and punished us with subtle, cruel measures. Food became scarce, not because there wasn't enough, but because it was withheld as a tool of control. Every meal felt like a reminder that we were powerless, dependent, and at his mercy. I watched my husband struggle silently, his body weakening, his pride battered. He could not defend himself, and I could not defend him. Even our sons sensed the tension. His laughter became quieter, his steps more cautious, as if the air itself had grown dangerous. At night, I lay awake listening to my husband's uneven breathing, his quiet sighs carrying a weight he could no longer shoulder. And I realized something terrifying. Our home was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a cage, and every day the walls seemed to close in further. I tried to speak, to protest, but my words were small against the enormity of the owner's power. Every plea met with silence or disdain. Every attempt at negotiation rejected. Without consideration, and in that silence, I felt a shift inside myself. I could not stop the world from crushing us, but I could begin to prepare. Prepare for endurance. Prepare for resistance. Prepare for a fight we hadn't yet imagined. That was the first day I truly understood what it meant to live under someone else's complete control. Not as a worker, not as a tenant, but as a creature entirely at the mercy of another's will. From that day on, the shadow of oppression was no longer just a possibility. It was our daily reality. After the initial cruelty, the days became unbearable. It was no longer just subtle torment or deprivation, it became physical confinement. The landowner decided we could no longer leave the house at will. Every time we even tried to step outside, we were reminded sharply that our freedom no longer existed. Doors that once opened into the world now felt like barriers, walls closing in on every side, trapping us in a life dictated by someone else's whims. At first, I thought it might be temporary, a threat to scare us, to force compliance. But soon, it became clear. This was a new reality. I watched my husband, weak from illness, trying to resist the weight of this imprisonment. But his body failed him. He could not even move across the room without pain. I had to assist him just to go from one corner to another. Our son did not understand the fear that had entered our lives. He simply knew that the world outside had disappeared, that he could no longer play freely or run into the fields as he used to. His small hands clung to me, his innocent eyes asking questions I could not answer. The landowner visited frequently, checking that we stayed in our place. Every visit was filled with cold observation, words sharp as knives, glances that reminded us we had no control. At night, I lay awake, watching my husband sleep restlessly. My son curled beside me, and I felt the weight of despair pressing down. Yet, amid this darkness, a tiny flame of determination sparked within me. If words and obedience had failed, then endurance would become our weapon. We would survive this. We would find a way, and though the house had become a prison, I refused to let it break my spirit entirely. Once we were trapped, the cruelty escalated. It was no longer only about confinement. The landowner began making demands that were unfair, impossible, and demeaning. At first, they were small. Carry extra loads beyond our strength, finish chores that even two healthy people could barely manage, attend to tasks at odd hours, without explanation. But soon the demands became personal. He expected obedience in every aspect of our lives, not just work. Even the simplest choices, when to eat, what to wear, how to speak, were dictated by him. I watched my husband struggle, his body weak from illness, his hands trembling as he tried to meet every requirement. The man who had once managed acres of land with confidence now struggled to satisfy a single tyrant's whims. I tried to intervene, to negotiate, to explain, but each attempt was met with disdain or threats. Do as I say or face the consequences, he would growl. Our son began to sense the tension. He stopped laughing freely. He stayed close to me, and his questions, innocent and curious, were met with silence or hurried answers. I realized that the owner's cruelty was not accidental. It was intentional. He enjoyed control, the power to bend lives according to his will, and we had become nothing more than pieces on his board. I began to feel the weight of despair pressing in, but alongside it, a stubborn spark of resistance grew. I knew we could not fight him openly, but I could plan. I could endure. I could wait for the right moment. The days were long, filled with toil and silent suffering, but within the suffering, my mind began to sharpen. I would not allow this man to destroy everything we had worked for, not without a fight. The first stage of exploitation had begun, but I resolved that it would not be the last word in our story. There came a moment when I could no longer stay silent. The landowner's demands were no longer just burdens. They were violations of our dignity. I had to speak, even if it meant putting myself at risk. One day, he ordered my husband to perform a task that was physically impossible for him now. I looked at him struggling, and without thinking, I spoke up. This is too much. You cannot expect him to do this in his condition. The air shifted instantly. The room, once merely tense, became charged. His eyes, usually cold and calculated, now burned with fury. "You dare speak to me?" he asked, his voice low but deadly. "Do you understand the consequences of questioning me?" I swallowed hard, but I didn't back down. "I am asking for fairness. You cannot treat a sick man as if he is worthless," I said firmly. For a brief moment, silence hung in the air like a knife. Then he smiled cold, sharp, and cruel. "So be it," he said. "You will learn the price of your words." From that day forward, the punishment began. The work became harsher, the expectations more impossible. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in even tighter. Every glance he gave reminded me that resistance came with a cost. I watched my husband struggle, unable to defend himself, and I realized that my courage had drawn more attention to our vulnerability. Our son clung to me, sensing the tension, innocent and confused by the hatred that now filled the air. Yet, even in the face of this cruelty, I felt a strange strength rising within me. I had spoken the truth, and though it came with a heavy price, I knew I could not remain silent again. Every demand, every punishment, every harsh glance was a lesson. To survive, one must endure a plan and wait for the right moment. And deep down, I promised myself I would not let them win. By now, the weight of our captivity had become unbearable. Every day felt like a battle between despair and the instinct to survive. I could see it in my husband's eyes, the helplessness, the frustration, the pain. But I could also see it in my own heart. I would not let our son grow up under this oppression. It started with small plans. At first, I only imagined leaving, pacing the house at night, plotting routes, thinking about where we could go, who might help us, how we could slip past the watchful eyes. One evening, when the landowner and his overseers were away, I decided it was time to act. I held my son close, whispering to him to stay quiet, and I tried to lift my husband from his chair, but his body betrayed him. Even a few steps were agony, his legs trembling, refusing to obey. My heart sank, and I realized that any attempt to flee with him in his current state would be impossible without attracting immediate attention. Still, I refused to give up. Over the next weeks, I tried again and again, timing our movements, watching for moments of carelessness, slipping into shadows, trying to find even a tiny gap in the chains of our confinement. Each attempt failed. Sometimes it was my husband's weakness, sometimes the watchful eyes of the landowner's aides, sometimes sheer misfortune. Every failure left me shaken, exhausted, and filled with dread. But it also left me more determined. I realized that survival was not just about strength. It was about patience, cunning, and endurance. I started to study the house, the movements of the guards, the routines of the landowner, looking for patterns, searching for openings. Even in the moments of despair, a spark of hope remained. I whispered to my son during these nights, "Someday we will be free. We must be careful, we must be patient, but we will leave this place." And though fear and exhaustion weighed heavily on me, I knew that running was the only path to saving our lives. I had tasted the bitterness of helplessness, and I vowed never to return to it. Every failed attempt was a lesson, every setback a reminder. Escape would not be easy, but I would find a way no matter how long it took. It was one of those nights that stay etched in your memory forever when fear feels like a living, breathing entity, and hope seems miles away. My husband lay weak and exhausted in the corner of our small, dimly lit room. His body, once strong and capable, now trembled even as he tried to sit up. He could no longer support himself, and I had to help him with every movement. I felt anger and sorrow mix in my chest, but more than anything, I felt fear for him, for our child, for the fragile life we were clinging to. Our son slept beside me, his small hand clutching mine. I whispered to him softly, "Stay quiet, my love. Everything will be all right." I repeated it like a prayer, though I had no certainty, no guarantee that it would be true. That night, the landowner came. He did not announce himself. He did not knock. He entered as if the house and all within it belonged entirely to him, because, in truth, for that night, it did. His presence was oppressive, filling every corner. He demanded things that were impossible, Tasks my husband could no longer perform, chores that even I struggled to complete, and obedience that left no room for hesitation when I tried to speak, to explain that my husband was ill or that the child was scared. He only gave a cold, dismissive stare. His voice, when it came, was sharp, commanding, and without mercy. "You will do as I say," he said, "or suffer the consequences." For hours, I watched helplessly as he manipulated, U.S. forcing compliance through fear and humiliation. Every instruction was a test. Every glance a reminder that we had no power. By the time he left, my body ached from exhaustion, my hands raw from trying to lift, hold and manage my husband and son, and my heart felt as if it had been pressed. Through a vice, I sat on the floor, holding both of them, and cried silently, afraid that if I let my voice escape, it would be the last sound of hope I could give my son. That night, I understood the depth of the oppression we were under. It was not just about losing a home or work, it was about erasing our very sense of self. The house that had once felt like a shelter had become a prison. Every corner, every shadow, every object reminded us of our powerlessness. Yet, even in that darkness, something began to grow within me. A quiet, determined spark. I realized that fear could not be the end of our story. Even if we were broken for now, we would endure. We would survive. And someday we would take back the life that had been stolen from us. After that night, life became a continuous battle of endurance. For 2 long years, we existed in a world ruled entirely by the landowner's whims, where every day felt heavier than the last. My husband, weakened by illness, could no longer stand as a barrier between us and oppression. He did what he could, moving with pain and effort, but most tasks fell to me. I carried our survival on my shoulders, feeding him, caring for him, and shielding our son from the harshest blows. Every day was repetitive, yet filled with tension. We followed every command, completed every task, yet there was never relief, only the constant fear of new demands, of punishments, of unpredictable cruelty. I learned to watch, to study every movement of the landowner, his habits, his moods, the timing of his visits. Everything became part of a careful mental map I held in my mind. I knew that any lapse could mean disaster. During these years, I became both mother and protector, teacher and strategist, watching my child grow in a world that should have been safe, yet was filled with fear and suppression. I realized patience was as much a weapon as courage. Every moment of endurance, every small act of obedience was not submission. It was preparation. I was learning, waiting, building strength in the silence so that one day I could act decisively and reclaim our lives, even in those long, heavy days. Small sparks of hope survived. A glance between my husband and me, our son laughing quietly despite the tension, reminded me why survival mattered. And with every passing day, I grew more certain. The moment would come when endurance alone would no longer be enough, and I would need to strike with all the planning, patience, and courage I had gathered in those 2 long years. By the 3rd year of our struggle, I began to notice a disturbing pattern. While we suffered under strict rules, forced labor, and constant surveillance, the landowner lived in a world completely detached from responsibility. He spent hours entertaining friends, indulging in luxuries, laughing loudly while we toiled endlessly. The laughter, the music, the banquets, they were a cruel reminder of how little our suffering mattered to him. I saw him make careless decisions, ignoring the work we had done carefully. Sections of the fields were neglected for days, even though my husband and I had spent hours tending them. Tasks we performed perfectly were disregarded. While trivial matters were blown out of proportion to punish us, I watched his friends enjoy themselves, completely indifferent to the labor we provided. They ate, drank, and joked, while my son and I stood silently nearby, afraid to even breathe too loudly. Each indulgence was a stark contrast to our reality. Where they had comfort, we had fatigue. Where they had freedom, we had confinement. Where they had laughter, we held back tears. Yet, this carelessness revealed something to me. It showed that the landowner's power, while terrifying, was also flawed. He was arrogant and overconfident, relying on fear to maintain control rather than genuine skill or intelligence. This realization became a seed of hope. I began to think if he could indulge himself so carelessly, then perhaps his defenses could be manipulated, exploited, or bypassed, even in the midst of oppression. I learned to observe, calculate, and plan. Every careless action, every indulgence, became a clue, a small step toward reclaiming our freedom and a future where we would no longer be trapped in his world in the midst of all the suffering. My son became the anchor that kept me from falling entirely into despair. His small hand in mine reminded me daily why I had to endure, why I had to plan, and why I could not give up. He was only 2 when our ordeal intensified, but even at that age, he sensed the tension, the fear, and the oppression around us. Sometimes he would look up at me with wide, innocent eyes, and I could see the questions he could not yet ask. Why is life so harsh? Why can't we go outside? I held him close and whispered stories, not the ones he wanted to hear about fields or the outside world, but stories of hope, courage, and patience. I told him we were strong and that even in the darkest times, light could return. He laughed quietly sometimes, even in our small, confined home. Those small moments of joy were my lifeline. I would watch him sleep at night, his soft breathing, a rhythm of calm in a world full of chaos. Through my son, I learned endurance in a different way. I learned that strength was not just about physical labor, but about carrying hope for someone else. Even when the world seemed determined to crush it, every plan I made, every small act of defiance, was fueled by the thought of him, my child, my reason, my spark. I realized that if I failed, he would lose not just a home, but a sense of safety, love, and belief in life itself. And so, even when my body ached, even when my spirit felt cornered, I drew courage from him. He was small, yet he gave me the strength of giants. It was in those moments, holding my son close in the quiet of the night, that I vowed silently, no matter what it took, I would protect him, and I would reclaim our life. After 2 long years of endurance, I realized that survival alone would not be enough. We had endured, we had obeyed, but the time had come to take control of our lives or risk losing everything forever. I began to observe everything with a careful eye. The landowner's routines, the timings of his indulgences, the comings and goings of his friends, and even the smallest gaps in their attention all became clues. I started to gather resources quietly. Coins hidden in old jars, small items that could be used for leverage, information about the landowner's habits and weaknesses. Every small action was calculated, deliberate. Even the smallest mistake could undo everything. I knew that direct confrontation was impossible. We were physically weak, trapped, and outnumbered. So I began to plan patiently, looking for a way to manipulate the system without drawing attention. I involved no one else. Secrecy was essential. Every move had to be invisible, every resource carefully accounted for. During this time, my son became an unexpected ally. Even his small routines could signal opportunity. The way he slept, the moments he played quietly, and how he responded to visitors all became part of the careful calculations. At night, I would sit in silence, mapping out potential strategies, weighing risks and rewards, and imagining a day when we would finally be free. The landowner's carelessness, his indulgence, and his overconfidence became our tools. Every time he overlooked something or dismissed a detail, I stored that knowledge, knowing it could one day be the key to our escape. It was a slow, exhausting process, but with each passing day, I felt a small sense of empowerment returning. I realized that patience, observation, and careful planning were our only weapons against oppression. And in that realization, I knew one thing with certainty. The time would come when we would no longer be powerless. The landowner's reign over us would end. After months of observation and careful preparation, the moment finally arrived to put the plan into action. Every detail had been calculated, every risk assessed, and though fear lingered, determination outweighed it. I started with small steps, testing boundaries and reactions. The landowner's aides were predictable in their routines, leaving gaps that could be exploited. I moved quietly, deliberately, gathering the items we would need for our escape. My husband, weak as he was, had a role too. Even with limited strength, he could act at the precise moment, moving when the attention was elsewhere. Our son remained close, silent and observant, unknowingly aiding the plan simply by following instructions. Each action required absolute caution. A single misstep could alert the landowner, and all our efforts would collapse. I held my breath during every interaction, pretending obedience while preparing for freedom. I also began sowing subtle distractions. I created small, believable errors. In chores, just enough to divert attention without revealing our true intentions. The first night we moved quietly. Every sound felt magnified, every shadow suspicious. My heart pounded with anticipation and fear, but also with a fierce, growing hope. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of agency return. I realized that endurance had carried us this far, but action would carry us the rest of the way. As we inched closer to freedom, I reminded myself that patience and precision were as crucial as courage. One wrong move could undo everything, but the careful execution of our plan could finally reclaim our lives. That night, as we prepared, I looked at my son sleeping quietly and whispered, "Tomorrow, we take our first real step toward freedom." It was the beginning of the final chapter, the first action in a long-awaited journey to justice and liberation. The night of our first attempt at freedom was tense beyond words. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a possible threat. I moved slowly, deliberately, feeling my heart beat so loudly it seemed to echo in the confined room. The landowner's aides were patrolling as usual, their footsteps predictable yet intimidating. I had memorized their patterns over months, but even the slightest deviation could ruin everything. I helped my husband stand, supporting him carefully. His body was weak, trembling under the weight of long illness, but he trusted me completely. Our son clutched my hand silently, his small grip reminding me why failure was not an option. As he moved toward the door, I held my breath. A sudden noise, perhaps a falling utensil, made me freeze. I prayed that the sound would go unnoticed. Seconds felt like hours. Then, miraculously, silence returned. The aides had passed, unaware of our subtle movements. That brief moment of success brought both relief and fear. We were still far from safety. The house itself became a maze of obstacles, each corner a potential trap. Every step had to be measured. Every glance toward the corridors had to be calculated. During that night, I realized that courage alone was not enough. Patience, observation, and quick thinking were equally crucial. I had to act as both strategist and protector simultaneously, balancing the urgency of escape with the need for caution. By the time we returned to our temporary hiding spot inside the house, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. We had tested the plan, and for the first time, it had worked partially. The danger was real, but so was the hope. That night, I whispered to my husband and son, "Tomorrow we will move a little further. We are closer than we have ever been." Before, the first encounter with danger had proven one thing clearly: success required vigilance, courage, and unwavering resolve. Every small step forward was a battle, but also a victory. The following days were filled with tension and careful observation. Our first attempt at moving toward freedom had succeeded in part, but it also revealed just how fragile our plan truly was. One small mistake could have alerted the landowner or his aides. A slightly louder step, a shadow out of place, or even a misjudged glance could have ended everything. During our next attempt, I miscalculated the timing of the patrol. The aides were moving faster than usual, their lanterns swinging, and casting long, searching shadows across the corridors. For a moment, I froze. Our son's tiny hand gripped mine tightly, and I realized the danger of hesitation. I whispered instructions to my husband, guiding him carefully toward the nearest hiding spot. Every movement had to be deliberate and silent. We crouched behind. Furniture, held our breath, and waited. The aides passed, only inches from our hiding place. The seconds stretched endlessly, each heartbeat echoing like a drum in my chest. When they finally moved away, I exhaled quietly, feeling both relief and renewed determination. That near miss taught me valuable lessons. Every patrol must be memorized. Every gap in attention exploited, and patience was more important than speed. Rushing could be fatal. Fear could be fatal. I also realized how strong my son was. Even in the tense silence, he followed instructions without fear. His small presence, giving me both comfort and courage. By the end of that night, I had a renewed sense of strategy. Mistakes would happen, they were inevitable, but each one could teach us something vital. Every narrow escape became a lesson. Every moment of danger a step closer to freedom. I whispered to my son as we returned to our hiding place, "Do you see, my love? Even danger can teach us how to survive. We are learning, and one day we will be free." That night I knew survival required more than courage. It required constant learning, adaptation, and unwavering resolve. After months of careful observation, I began to notice the landowner's patterns weren't perfect. His indulgences, his overconfidence, and the trust he placed in his friends revealed cracks in his control that we could exploit. He believed that fear alone kept us obedient. He had no idea we were watching, planning, and learning from every move he made. His arrogance became our advantage. I began to set small traps, not to harm anyone, but to test his reactions and identify weaknesses. I noticed which tasks he cared about most, which demands he enforced personally, and which ones he delegated carelessly to others. Every moment of his carelessness became valuable information. I memorized the timing of his visits, the routes his aides took, and the moments when his attention was elsewhere. Even his friends' indulgences played into our hands. Their laughter, careless chatter, and lack of observation revealed moments of opportunity. I realized we can manipulate these moments to our advantage, slipping by unnoticed, or creating diversions that bought us precious time. This turning point gave me confidence. For the first time, I saw a path where fear did not dictate our actions. We could act strategically. We could exploit their flaws. We could reclaim some control over our lives. I shared small instructions with my husband, keeping him involved without burdening him too much. Every day, every small observation strengthened our plan. That night, as I watched my son sleep peacefully, I felt a quiet determination solidify in my heart. We were no longer merely surviving. We were preparing to strike back at the forces that had oppressed us for years. The turning point had arrived. And from that moment, patience, courage, and calculated action became our weapons. This was the moment when planning turned into opportunity. For the first time, we weren't just reacting to danger, we were shaping it. The landowner's habits had become predictable. On certain evenings, his attention drifted elsewhere, absorbed in comfort, indulgence, and careless company. Those moments created gaps, small, fragile gaps, but real ones. I decided to create a diversion, subtle enough to seem natural, yet effective enough to pull attention away from us. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise suspicion. Just a quiet disturbance carefully placed at the right time. I altered a routine task slightly, knowing it would cause confusion among the aides. They would argue about responsibility, about who had failed and why. Blame would move in circles away. From us, as expected, tension spread among them. Voices rose, footsteps multiplied, attention shifted outward instead of inward. The house became noisy in the wrong places, and silent where it mattered most. That silence was our opening. I guided my husband carefully, step by step. Every movement was slower than fear demanded, but faster than doubt allowed. Our son stayed close, understanding without words. At this moment was different. For the first time, we crossed a boundary we had never dared approach before. A corridor once forbidden. A door once always guarded. My heart raced, not with panic, but with something new, control. Even when the diversion ended and order returned to the house, it was too late. We had already gained ground. That night taught me something vital. Power does not always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from timing, patience, and understanding the enemy better than they understand themselves. This was our first real advantage. And once you taste that kind of control, there is no going back. We were no longer trapped. We were advancing. In the process of planning our escape, I realized that we could not act alone. There were limits to what my husband, our son, and I could accomplish. We needed assistance, but trusting the wrong person could be catastrophic. A man approached me under the guise of helping. He seemed friendly, concerned, and aware of our struggles. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe he might be an ally. I whispered our plan, carefully omitting crucial details. Testing his reaction. At first, he appeared supportive, offering advice and guidance. He claimed he could help us bypass the landowner's watchful eyes. My hope, dormant for years, flickered back to life. But the landowner's overconfidence and my observations taught me caution. I noticed small inconsistencies in the man's story. He seemed too interested in the landowner's schedule, too eager to know about our hidden resources. My instincts screamed danger. Even when desperation pressed on me, I remembered the lessons of patience and vigilance. I tested him further, pretending to trust him fully, watching his reactions carefully. Every hesitation, every slight change in tone revealed his true intentions. It became clear. He was not an ally. He wanted advantage, not freedom. Had I let him guide our actions, our plan, and our lives would have been exposed. I withdrew, silently, cutting all communication while keeping him unaware that I had discovered his deception. That moment reinforced an essential truth. Freedom could not rely on blind trust. It required intelligence, observation, and careful judgment. My son and husband depended on me. I realized that any misstep in trust could destroy everything. From that day on, I resolved to act only on what I knew for certain, and to manipulate every opportunity carefully, ensuring that no one could deceive us again. This lesson was harsh, but it made us stronger. In a world of cruelty and oppression, the right decision often meant surviving alone. After the dangerous encounter with the false ally, I realized that finding someone trustworthy was nearly impossible. Yet, without help, our plan for escape would remain incomplete. We needed someone who understood the landowner's weaknesses, but who also had no personal gain in exploiting us. Weeks of careful observation led me to notice a quiet figure in the household, someone the landowner overlooked entirely. A worker who seemed loyal not out of fear but out of conscience. He moved silently, rarely attracting attention, yet he saw more than anyone realized. I began to test him subtly. A small question here, a careful observation there. His reactions were measured, honest, and cautious. Unlike the previous man, his concerns seemed genuine. He spoke in riddles at first, avoiding specifics, yet hinting at possibilities without compromising himself. I decided to take the risk. I shared part of our plan, carefully keeping critical details hidden while observing his responses closely. He nodded knowingly, never overpromising, but his subtle guidance confirmed what I had hoped. He could help us without endangering our secret. This was a turning point. Finally, after months of isolation and danger, we had an ally who could tip the balance in our favor. Together, we began to refine the plan timing, distractions, and the exact routes we would use to escape. The trust I placed in him was cautious, calculated. Every word, every step was monitored carefully. I could not afford mistakes, but his quiet wisdom and awareness gave me a glimmer of hope I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I believed that escape wasn't just a dream. It was possible, and with the right help, we could reclaim not only our freedom, but the dignity and life that had been stolen from us. The night had finally arrived. After months of planning, observation, and preparation, every piece of the puzzle was in place. Our secret ally had confirmed the safest paths, timed the landowner's routines, and ensured that our movements would go unnoticed if we acted precisely. I held my husband's trembling hand and looked at my son, his small eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. I whispered to him, "Tonight we will be free. Stay close, follow every instruction, and trust me." The house was quiet. The aides were distracted, the landowner indulging in one of his long banquets, laughing loudly with friends oblivious to the storm about to unfold. I moved slowly, step by step, guiding my husband through shadows and hidden corridors. Every sound was amplified in my mind, a creak of the floorboards, a distant laugh. Even our own breathing down our son clutched my skirt, silent but alert. We paused at each corner, listening, calculating every second before moving again. The tension was unbearable yet electric, fueling my determination. At one point, a lantern swung too close, casting light across our path. I froze, holding my breath. The shadow passed without notice. We continued, hearts pounding, knowing every movement brought us closer to freedom, but also closer to danger. Hours of careful navigation brought us to the first boundary that had once seemed insurmountable. A door that had always been locked, now quietly opened thanks to our secret ally. The outside world, fresh and open, waited on the other side. For a moment, we stopped. The cool night air filled our lungs, and I felt a rush of exhilaration I hadn't felt in years. We were so close, yet the risk remained. One mistake, one loud sound, could undo everything. I looked at my son sleeping lightly against my shoulder, then at my husband, exhausted but resolute, and whispered, "We are almost there." One final step. With steady hands, careful hearts, and unwavering courage, we crossed the threshold. The night of escape had begun, and with it, the possibility of a new life, free from fear, oppression, and cruelty. The moment we stepped into the night, the taste of freedom was intoxicating but fragile. The air was crisp, carrying the faint sounds of the estate behind us, and I knew that any noise, any misstep, could summon pursuit. We moved quickly, yet carefully. My husband's weakened legs struggled to keep pace, so I supported him, guiding each step with precision. Our son clung to me, silent but alert, his small body trembling from exhaustion and fear. A distant shout pierced the quiet night. The landowners' aides had discovered our absence. The chase had begun. Panic threatened to take hold, but I forced myself to remain calm. I prepared for this. Every shadow, every tree, every narrow path had been memorized. I led them through hidden routes, paths known only to a few who worked the land. Footsteps behind us grew louder. Shouts, barking dogs, and the clatter of torches followed. I whispered to my husband, "Keep moving. Trust me, we are almost safe." He nodded, exhausted, but held on. Every second felt like an eternity. One misstep, one stumble, and we would be dragged back into the life we were fleeing. I glanced at my son, seeing both fear and trust in his eyes. His faith in me gave me strength beyond measure. I pushed forward, ignoring pain, fatigue, and doubt. The world outside the estate was dark and unwelcoming, but it offered possibilities that the walls of our prison never could. We navigated through underbrush, silent streets, and forgotten pathways. Using every lesson learned over the past years, the chase was relentless, but so was my determination. I realized that fear could only control us if we allowed it. And in that moment, I refused to let fear win. With every step, we grew closer to safety, closer to freedom, closer to a life where the landowner's cruelty could no longer touch us. The chase had begun, but we were no longer powerless. Just when the relief of freedom seemed within reach, disaster almost struck. A torchlight appeared in the distance, swinging violently, followed by the unmistakable voices of the landowners. My heart lurched. Every instinct screamed to run faster, but my husband's weakened body made speed impossible. Our son clung to me, sensing the danger, his small hands gripping my skirt like a lifeline. A sudden shout split the night. "Stop! Don't let them escape!" Panic surged. I froze for a split second, heart hammering, realizing that one wrong move could end everything. Then I remembered every lesson of the past 2 years. Patience, observation, and careful planning. I scanned the path ahead, noticing a narrow alley between 2 walls, too small for more than one person at a time, perfect for slipping past our pursuers. "Follow me closely," I whispered to my husband. We moved silently, inch by inch, using shadows as shields. The torchlight swung dangerously close, Illuminating the edge of the alley dot, my son whimpered softly, but I pressed him to stay calm, whispering encouragement. Every second felt like hours, and the sound of our pursuers' footsteps grew closer. Louder, more menacing. At the last possible moment, we slipped into the alley, pressing ourselves against the walls as the torchlight passed by. The shouts faded. Behind us. We were unseen. I collapsed against the wall for a moment, breathing heavily, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from my body. Our hearts pounded, our legs shook, but we were still free. That near capture taught me an invaluable lesson. Freedom is fragile and vigilance is everything. One misstep can destroy years of careful planning. Yet in that moment of terror, a surge of triumph filled me. We had survived the first real test of our escape. And now nothing, not fear, not danger, not oppression, could break our resolve. After the terrifying chase, we finally found a small, hidden refuge, an abandoned shed tucked behind thick trees, far from the main house and the prying eyes of the landowner's men. I collapsed onto the ground, holding my husband close and gently, brushing our son's hair from his forehead. For the first time in years, I felt a sliver of safety, a brief pause from constant fear. The night was silent, except for the distant echoes of our pursuers, searching blindly, unaware that we had slipped through their grasp. I allowed myself to breathe slowly, feeling the tension in my muscles ease just slightly. We huddled together, shivering from exhaustion, but there was warmth in our closeness. I whispered softly to my son, "We are safe now, just for a while. Rest, my love. We will continue tomorrow." Even in this temporary safety, I remained alert. The landowner's cruelty was relentless, and our freedom was still fragile. I knew we couldn't linger too long, but this moment allowed us to recover and gather strength for the next stage of our escape. And that quiet refuge. I also reflected on the journey so far, the years of oppression, the careful planning, the narrow escapes, and the courage that had kept us alive. It strengthened my resolve. We were no longer victims. Though the night was dark, hope burned brightly in my heart. We were free, if only for now, and that freedom, no matter how temporary, was worth every risk, every hardship, every moment of fear. We rested, but our minds were already working, planning the next steps, ensuring that the next phase of our journey would bring us closer to permanent safety and justice. Finally, we had emerged from the shadows and dangers into the open, fresh air. The night was calm and cool, each breath filled with a sense of renewal. It was the first taste of freedom we had dreamed of for years. I supported my husband, holding our son close, and the three of us stood together, feeling a moment that once seemed impossible. Exhaustion and fear were present, but in our hearts shone the light of joy. Every step on the ground became a symbol of our newfound liberty. The years of hiding, fear, and constant surveillance were finally behind us. After taking a brief moment to recover, we realized that freedom alone was not enough. Justice had to be served. The next day, we went directly to the police station and recounted our entire story. The police acted immediately. Cases were registered against the landowner and his accomplices. Evidence was collected and investigations conducted. Within a short period, the court delivered its judgment. One received a 25-year sentence, the other 15 years. This verdict marked a new beginning for us. Not only were we free, but justice had been served, and those who had inflicted cruelty were held accountable. Our hearts were filled with joy and peace. That first night outside was not only the taste of freedom, it was freedom secured by law. We left behind the fear and imprisonment of the past and stepped into a new life, guided by hope and the power of justice.